I'm joined now in our Abuja studio by Amaka Anku, Africa head at Eurasia Group, to review some of these top stories in greater detail. Great to have you with us once again, Amaka. So lovely to be hearing you.
Thanks for having me.
So I wanted us to start with, thank you, Amaka. I wanted us to start with Nigeria's inflation figures, climbed to 33.95. Food inflation as well. You know, the president did mention that 60 to 70% of food produced was lost to bad roads and other infrastructure difficulties. Are you at all surprised by the figures? And, you know, what would you say to the outlook for inflation given the persistent monetary rate hikes by the central bank?
Yeah, look, it's a tough situation. And different people have different views on it. I know that a lot of analysts now think inflation will peak next month. Of course, there are other concerns that even the high interest rates could be inflationary, right? Because, you know, if manufacturers are borrowing at such high rates, they'll probably want to pass it on to their employees. There's some concerns that the minimum wage increases might also be inflationary. So it's really hard to tell when it's going to peak. But so I don't envy the central bank trying to figure this out. But I do think that at some point, towards the end of the year, we should start to see inflation come down for sure.
And, you know, you mentioned towards the end of the year, seeing inflation coming down. What would be the main driver of that? Would it be monetary policy or other types of reforms within the economy? The big question.
That's a good question. Look, I think it has to be all of the above. We all know that insecurity in the north is a big driver of inflation, right? If farmers can't go to market, we all know that poor infrastructure is a big driver of inflation. You know, to the president's comments, poor storage, poor transportation. So it has to be a total mix of policy here working together. You have to improve, food availability. You have to improve, inputs, so that there's more food production, especially because food inflation is even higher here, right? Almost 40%. So I think I do think that the monetary policy is working as well in terms of tightening Naira liquidity, but it has to be the entire basket, I think, that will bring it down.
Yes, indeed. It certainly has, because it definitely has repercussions across the wider economy. I want us to look at another major story coming out of Africa this week, and we might spend a bit of time on this one. South Africa. Cyril Ramaphosa was sworn in for his second term as South Africa's president, but this time there's an unusual dynamic with this coalition government. So I'd like to get your thoughts on this new political era for South Africa before we delve into some of the economic implications of this transition.
Yeah, look, so we at Eurasia Group, we are more negative on South Africa now because of the election outcome. So as you know, people who are listening probably know, the ruling party lost its majority. It didn't just lose its majority by a little bit, it lost its majority by a lot, and it's been forced into a coalition with the biggest opposition party, the Democratic Alliance. But they're calling it a government of national unity, and it seems like, and I've been looking at some news today, they're trying to bring in as many tiny little parties as possible so that they're not completely reliant on the Democratic Alliance. And the reason we are negative is because I think people underestimate just how difficult it is for the base of both political parties, the ruling party and the Democratic Alliance, to get along. Right, so the current leadership of the ANC and the president, Cyril Ramaphosa, has certain relationships with certain DA leaders. They like him. He has the business background. But a lot of people in both parties don't really like each other that much, don't really get along that much. And that will make the coalition politics difficult, more difficult than the market realizes today.
Yeah.
So that's something that we're watching very closely. And I think it's going to be very unstable for South Africa.
Yeah, it's interesting that you said Eurasia Group is a bit negative in terms of the outlook, because if you look at some of the economic readings in the immediate announcement of the coalition government, the South African banking index has been up by 17% since over a month. We also have the South African rand, which has somewhat stabilized. And then we heard news that the Democratic Alliance was providing support to the government's reform plan. So, I mean, are these not readings or signs to take note of?
Look, all those numbers, those indicators you're mentioning tell us, what we're saying. The market is very positive about this, right? The rand is overperforming because a lot of market participants think this is good for South Africa because they see the DA as potentially bringing more fiscal prudence and maybe helping move the government towards better governance. We are more skeptical, right?
Okay.
We are more skeptical because the coalition, the politics of working together will be a lot more difficult than we think the market realizes. It's very unlikely that the DA will get positions like finance or like really critical portfolios in the cabinet. And we see this falling apart quicker than people realize, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, and if you think about the election outcome, the big winner in the election was former President Jacob Zuma's party. Mm-hmm. That is completely different in terms of economic policy positioning. And I know you want to talk about that from the DA. So if you're the ruling party and you're thinking about elections coming up in just 2 years, you're probably more likely to move in that direction of what your base is telling you they want, and not in the direction of the DA, which hasn't been growing in years in terms of their support.
Yeah, it's interesting.
So it's going to be tricky for them to balance all of that.
Yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned former President Jacob Zuma's sort of gains, because those gains certainly took away from the share of support that the ANC had. But I want to delve a bit deeper into this, because the DA is sort of pursued as the sort of more liberal, free market economics type party. And of course, you pointed to the base of the ANC. So there's obviously an ideological gulf there, which they will need to bridge. Yes. But in the event that certain key portfolios like finance or even energy, given the energy crisis, do go to the DA, the Democratic Alliance, would your outlook possibly be more positive? I know you see it as a highly improbable scenario, but assuming that did happen, what can we then expect from the South African economy?
That's a good question. So we will consider, so if something like energy goes to DA, we will reconsider. But here's the thing, Rolake. Governance and decision-making in South Africa is often very consensus-based, particularly in the ANC. And so you still have, it's still, with 20% of votes, the DA is still a minority party. Okay, you're still, even with the ANC at 40%, you still don't have a majority of support. So what that means is, even if you get a portfolio like energy, which we think is unlikely, it's going to be difficult for that person who gets that portfolio to make decisions independently in the way that they would want to make it. So let me give you an example. Eskom, the state utility company, they are in the process of unbundling it, similar to the process Nigeria did, right? Many years ago, where you have this state utility that provides electricity and it controls everything from transmission to generation to distribution, and they're unbundling those into separate entities to function, more commercially, with the idea that in the long term, they might, increase private ownership in the way that we've done it in Nigeria. Okay. Now, in order to do that, one of the things that has been pending is that you need to appoint board members onto these new entities to actually enable them function. Now, you are going to have to agree on who those board members will be. Okay? Those are the kinds of decision-making that we think will be very difficult. Even if you get somebody from the DA in the energy portfolio, they're going to be able to agree with the power brokers in the ANC on who those board members should be.
Sure.
Because they have very different views about who's competent and who's not. And so, look, we think that this is going to be a lot more difficult in practice than it looks like in policy. And if you don't agree on who board members should be, nothing happens.
Indeed. Your points have been very well taken, very well argued. Thank you. Just one more question on South Africa. What do you think the most important policy priority should be? You probably saw there on the screen that unemployment was at 33%. There's still outstanding issues around land reform. There's the energy crisis. There's trying to sort of ramp up production in the mining sector. What would you say should be this unity government's economic priority?
Look, the key issue for South Africa is growth.
Okay.
South Africa hasn't grown above replacement level for over a decade, frankly, since the global financial crisis in 2008. And of course, if growth then brings jobs, and unemployment is a huge issue. But the big structural issue that, in our view, has been limiting growth too is that you have a majority of the population that's locked out of the economy because they don't have access to land, collateral, credit, wealth. And that's the majority of the population. And in South Africa, it happens to go along racial lines. And so the challenge here, and the challenge that South Africa has been dealing with, is that it's been trying to figure out how to balance sort of maintaining like a large portion of your population that is poor, by giving them social grants, sort of maintaining living standards while investing for growth. But if you're spending a lot of money on kind of maintaining living standards by giving people social grants, you have less money to make investments for growth. And there's something that they're going to have to figure out. And another reason why we think this coalition with the DA will be difficult, because the DA doesn't like to spend money on social grants, doesn't believe in things like redistribution of land, doesn't want, Black economic empowerment. They just want to focus on trickle down, grow the economy and then things will, redistribute in an organic way. The problem is that it's been so long since the transition to multiracial democracy, people are feeling like doing it the way that the DA wants to do it isn't giving results fast enough. So I think this is going to be the main challenge for economic policy, is how do you balance, how do you figure out how to make investments for growth while maintaining social stability?
Yes, indeed. And, there's no doubt that expectations will be high. Those of us who follow South African politics and economy have seen the evolution of things like Black economic empowerment and questions around how successful some of those targeted policies have been. We certainly wish the unity government of South Africa all the very best. It will certainly be a tall order. Let's move on to another African country. We're focusing a lot on other African countries today. Kenya. There were protests in Kenya on the back of William Ruto, who has actually been causing a lot of international economic support for the country. And the Kenyan parliament has actually passed the controversial finance bill. Can you help us peel away what the key issues around this bill are for Kenyans?
Okay, so I think it's fascinating because they're having a similar conversation to what we're having in Nigeria. Look, Kenya spends a large portion of its revenue servicing its debt, and a big portion of its budget too, because it has a lot of debt. And so one of the things it's trying to do is raise more revenue to create more space to do other things, because it still has to service its debt. There are two ways, you have to either raise revenue or you cut spending in terms of fiscal consolidation, right, to avoid a debt crisis. They've chosen to go the revenue raising route. The problem is people in Kenya feel that the government isn't signaling belt tightening from the government, right? So you're telling us to pay more, but you're still doing lavish things with your money. Very similar to what Nigerians talk about, right? So that's the context. But the government in Kenya has been willing to put a lot of political capital behind forcing these revenue measures through. To be fair, they haven't actually passed yet, but we think that they're going to pass. So they've passed the second reading, but they haven't passed the entire finance bill. But we think that's likely to happen. But that's been the argument.
Yeah. And of course, according to the reports, through this new tax increase, they hope to raise 2.7 billion. dollars, I think, of new revenue, incremental revenue to the government. I'm just wondering what the outlook for the sectors that will help sort of deliver that quantum of incremental revenue to the country. What are the economic fundamentals from a sector perspective? Where is the focus of some of these fiscal measures?
Yeah, it's fairly broad-based. They had proposed some changes. Okay, some of the things that they had to pull back, right? They had proposed raising VAT on mobile transactions, but there's now going to be new levies on petrol. So when you're buying your fuel, you're not just paying for the price of fuel, but you're paying taxes on top. There's some road maintenance levies. There's some new taxes for corporates. It's fairly broad-based. What I will say though, that it's important. Like, I'm a big fan of African countries raising revenue.
Right.
Because if you look at a country like Ghana, for example, they didn't raise revenue, and look at how they ended up. And what Kenya has to do, they ended up having to restructure their debt, and that's going to set them back. What Kenya has to do is that they need to figure out the balance between raising revenue and cutting spending, right? Even if it's signaling, like, you have to find some things to cut so that people feel better about giving you more of their money.
Yeah, indeed. Amaka, Anku, it's a very interesting discussion. We see lots of commonalities between many African countries sort of trying to implement tight fiscal measures, but also trying to carry along the population and deliver inclusive growth. We certainly will continue to come to you for your feedback and outlook on some of these economic measures. Thanks so much for your time. As always, great to talk with you and glean from your wealth of experience.